level of concern for our fellow human beings, our neighbors, and our families, it can feel like we are living in the twilight zone. Friends, we must not lose faith, and we must not lose hope, but we must take heed. We must speak out, and we absolutely must prepare.
There's very conflicting reports coming out of Japan about the status of the nuclear plants. There's some stories saying that they've managed to move several of the reactors into a safe situation. They don't talk about the spent fuel pools, which we haven't either. There's stories that say that such and such a reactor number 3, for example, now has electrical power. But the exact status is unknown at this moment. It's quite possibly, and it seems to me quite possibly still very much out of control. But it was out of control as we went into the weekend. It was absolutely out of control. In fact, the reactors were so hot that they didn't want to send people in. The controllers were not in the control room because they didn't have any clue what was going on with the reactor. News reports were saying how they were able to see a gigantic explosion, which they believe was reactor number 3. Now, there's 6 reactors. It's a very big complex. In order to get such a viewpoint and not be in the radiation yourself, you have to be standing back somewhere, and it clearly was not in the control room. So they weren't in the control room. They were not in control. They were completely out of control. And remember, there are 6 Fukushima reactors. 3 of them were not operating at the time of the tsunami and the earthquake. We are told they were in safe shutdown. 3 of them were operating. Number 1, 2, and 3 were the ones that were operating. Number 4, 5, and 6 were not operating. Each of these reactors has spent fuel pool, and there's one additional common spent fuel pool for all 6. All of these spent fuel pools, all 7 spent fuel pools, are themselves gigantic problems, especially under the situation we see in Japan where they had a loss of coolant. So even when they were talking about the reactors, they weren't telling us what was going on with the spent fuel pools. And the nuclear experts, the anti-nuclear experts and the nuclear experts who know this, know that the spent fuel pools are there and are wondering what's going on with the spent fuel pools. We're not being told anything. TEPCO was not telling. GE was not telling. The American press was repeating the nonsense coming out of Japan, and they were not telling, or they were actively covering it up by making statements, for example, that said the reactor number 3 has had a hydrogen explosion. This is because the pressure built up, and they did a planned release of steam, which created a hydrogen explosion because of the combination of hydrogen with oxygen outside the building. And nobody is at any risk from the radiation. There's no radiation risk. This is what they've done forever. The nuclear industry says in one breath, they say there was a leak today reported at the 3 Mile Island, but there's no risk to the public. They're always in the same sentence, and this is exactly what they did, downplaying the problem in Japan from day 1 to day 10. And then we can talk about the emergency events like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, or Fukushima reactor. And then we can talk about the spent fuel pool. And they all have different radioisotopes associated with their operations and with their releases. And the spent fuel pool has something called cesium-137. Cesium-137 is incredibly toxic, and it moves into our environment mostly through the aquatic systems, which means as the nuclear plant sucks water in from the Pacific Ocean at Fukushima, cools the reactor and sends the water back out, and comes in, cools the spent fuel pool and sends it back out, and it doesn't flow right in between the rods. It's a separated thing where you've got the coolant system is such that you're not pulling the water right off the spent fuel pool and dumping into the ocean. It's separated. But at the same time, it's radiated, and it's leaking and dumping cesium-137 into the ocean or the Connecticut River or the Great Lakes of the United States or the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. So the spent fuel pool is all these packed spent fuel rods, and they have to be cooled. And they're in the spent fuel pool because what do we do with nuclear waste? In the United States, there's probably 104 spent fuel pools. Each reactor has one, or maybe each reactor site. For example, there's 3 Millstone reactors in southern Connecticut, and they may have one common spent fuel pool. But the typical spent fuel pool has the radioactive capacity in terms of radioactivity and devastation. For example, Hiroshima was, I believe, 1,000 curies worth of radiation. Hiroshima, the atomic bomb. A typical spent fuel pool has 75 million curies of radiation, of radioactive destruction. Why do we have spent fuel pools? Why do we have swimming pools sitting around at 55 or 104 locations in the United States? And I say 55 because I'm dividing 104 in 2 effectively, or we could divide it in 3 and say at best there's 33 or 35 spent fuel pools in the United States, but I'd say it's closer to 104. Why do we have these little swimming pools full of nuclear waste? Because we have no place to put it. Because they want to put it at Yucca Mountain or the Mescalero Apache Initiative, which is to dump it on a Mescalero Apache site in either New Mexico, Arizona, or Nevada. Or dump it deep down. Okay. They want to put it in Yucca Mountain. They've got this big nuclear site, this gigantic hole they've created at Yucca Mountain, spending billions and billions and billions of taxpayer dollars. And they realized, and experts have come forward and said, you just can't pump it down in there. It's going to get into the water systems. It's going to get into the earth. It's going to make us all sick. So experts have said this, but the government is trying to move forward the Yucca Mountain project, which basically you put spent fuel onto trucks or trains, you ship it across the country from Massachusetts or from Vermont, and you put it down in the ground, way down there, claiming that there's not going to be an earthquake or there's not going to be a flood or nothing's going to affect it.
Interestingly, I'm sure they'll pop up with the usual global warming nonsense, that it's better to die of radiation than it is to have these imaginary extreme weather events caused by CO2, when we know that they're not caused by CO2 at all.
Yeah, countries do go to war against each other from time to time. Well, as we've noticed since the Iraq War, it's hardly a mutually equal situation. These are not wars in my book. They're slaughters.
If you thought of something like an Israel versus Iran conflict, you could be absolutely sure that the nuclear facilities in both countries would be bombed by each other, and that would have catastrophic consequences. Mm.
I think personally that this is not something new. What is new is that they've admitted it. I mean, it's not as if they came along one morning and said, "Oh look, there's a crack in the reactor. Gosh, I didn't see that before. Yeah, I wonder what happened. Must be the mice." I mean, this must have happened when the thing exploded ages ago. So it's quite clear that this is just the same as Chernobyl, that what happens is that they let the information out slowly for whatever reason, and eventually they have to concede that there are these massive problems. Yes, well, the answer is it's a nightmare. The whole thing is a nightmare, but it was quite clear that it was a nightmare more to those of us who understood these things more or less from the beginning. And you're quite right, that these plutonium particles are extremely serious, and also uranium particles, I have to say. And they can't be measured easily with Geiger counters. They're not detectable. You need a special sort of scintillation counter to detect them. And I expect they have these. But when they say that the dose rate is so many microsieverts per hour, it doesn't really include the doses from these particles. And of course, in any case, these doses from the particles are internal doses, so you can't really measure them. You can only find out afterwards that there's been a problem. And I have to say that not only not telling the people, but also all of the pundits that come onto the radio programs that are wheeled out by the nuclear industry and their supporters, all those people who say there's no problem, don't worry, it's the same as going on a flight to New York, and all of this stuff, those people are criminally irresponsible, because people could have got away, you know, they could have taken some sort of measures to reduce their radiation exposure. That is actually 10 times higher than the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So that's the first thing you have to say, is that out to 30 kilometers, and the Chernobyl exclusion zone is 30 kilometers, so they're strictly comparable. The Fukushima contamination is 10 times higher per square meter. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the contamination out to 78 kilometers, also published by the UN, is 1 megabecquerels per square meter, or as high as, and so that is twice as high as the level in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where everybody was, you will recall, where the Soviet authorities, after 3 days, evacuated everybody. Now, we are now 2 weeks from the beginning of this, and people certainly haven't been evacuated in the areas where the contamination is coming down. And the reason why is because there are just too many people and there's nowhere to put them. This stuff from Fukushima, this radioactivity from Fukushima, all these particles and the iodine and the cesium and the plutonium and the uranium and the tellurium-132 and all of these isotopes are going to Tokyo, which has a population of 36 million. As I understand it, it's the largest concentration of human beings in any city on Earth. So this is why Fukushima is so bad. First of all, there's more contamination in the area, and secondly, it's sitting right on top of a very large population center, and also, you know, of course, it'll get spread around as people move away, as they drive out of the area, as the aeroplanes fly away from Tokyo and land in other countries. people will be carrying the radioactivity with them.
Well, I tell you what, Japan has a big, long history of leaders committing suicide when they've messed up in a big way, and this is a case where they've messed up in a big way. So who knows what will happen? But at any rate, the idea that the TEPCO and the government has been covering up what's going on and has not been releasing information and is trying to downplay this incident is despicable. And if the puppet commonly known as President Obama, or more accurately his string pullers, were at all serious about the idea of military-backed human intervention, they would have been out here deploying U.S. military assets to do the sarcophagus option and dropping cement on that site. You had an excellent article up yesterday from Hiroshi Takashi at Infowars.com, what they're covering up at Fukushima, that everybody needs to go and read, because he's shooting from the hip, and he is a nuclear expert who's basically saying that they're just ludicrous trying to downplay this, and the only real option left is to bury that place in cement and give up.
Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever had, redemption songs, redemption songs.
Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We got to fulfill the book. So won't you help to sing these songs of freedom?
British soldiers were authorized to write their own search warrants, for example. So the framers prohibited that in the Fourth Amendment, which states that only judges can issue search warrants, and they may only do so when the government presents evidence to them of a crime. Well, that hasn't worked out because the Patriot Act lets federal agents write their own search warrants. The Constitution protects businesses by prohibiting states from interfering with voluntary contracts between businesses and consumers. Well, that hasn't worked out because the states today tax almost every voluntary exchange we have. In some states, almost $1 of what you pay for a gallon of gas goes to the government. The Fifth Amendment prohibits the government from taking property without paying for it, just as the King and the Parliament had done. Well, that too hasn't worked out as planned because the feds take property from us almost every day. It's called income taxes. I think you get the point of this. The whole purpose of the Constitution was to assure that the government would respect individual liberty, that power would be separated between the states and the federal government, and the government would remain within the confines of the Constitution. Throughout history, the government has openly mocked the Constitution. Lincoln claimed he could violate parts of it in order to preserve other parts. Wilson said that somehow it gave him the power to tell folks how to live. FDR actually wrote laws himself and had them enforced, even though the Constitution only permits Congress to write laws. George W. Bush signed laws into existence and in the act of signing them said he never intended to enforce them. Yesterday, President Obama signed an executive order claiming the right to incarcerate persons in the Guantanamo Bay military prison for the rest of their natural lives, even after acquittal. After acquittal, yes, you heard that correctly. Following upon what President Bush proclaimed, President Obama claimed the power to punish people even after a jury has found them not guilty. No Western government has ever claimed the power to do this. Not the King of England, not Hitler, not Stalin, not even the Russian and Chinese communists. Now, I realize that most Americans have little sympathy for those incarcerated at Gitmo. Most assume that because they're there, they must be guilty of something. But that view turns the Constitution on its head. When he was a senator and running for president, Barack Obama knew that and stated that the beauty of the Constitution is that it guarantees fairness to everyone. He was right. But as president, he wants to lock people up forever, even after a jury finds them not guilty. Why should you care about this? Because if the government gets away with it by demonizing these prisoners and making it the popular thing to happen, it might happen to you.